in watching this and are unable to attend right now. So good morning. Well, it's morning over here for me in Seattle. It might be midday for some of you on the East Coast right now, but welcome. It's actually the evening right now for our speaker today. So Emily Snow is going to be speaking to us, and Emily is based in the Netherlands. So we tried to choose this date on the weekend to accommodate all time zones as best as possible. So my name is Monica Bowen. I help with the programs with the William Morris Society in the United States. I'm on the board, and I also am the person who helps with communications too. So the emails that you receive typically are from me. So I'm looking forward to this presentation, especially because Emily Snow and I have some mutual contacts and some overlaps in our education and training, but we've actually never gotten to meet. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Emily today. Emily's talk is William Morris, Subverting Victorian Gender Roles Through Iceland-Inspired Design. So Emily is an art historian, a writer, and a content marketing professional that's based in Amsterdam. She earned her BA in Art History and Curatorial Studies from Brigham Young University and an MA in Art History from the Courtauld Institute of Art, with an emphasis on Victorian art. I know that she has also been involved with curating a project that involves Iceland, and so this topic I think is especially personal to her, and I'm really excited to hear about her experiences. So Emily, I will turn this over to you and would love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Monica. Let's see. Can we see everything okay? Okay, perfect. Then I will begin. So good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone here, depending on where you are, and thank you so much for joining me virtually. Today I'm going to explore how William Morris's travels to Iceland not only influenced his artistic development, but also likely empowered him to subvert the oppressive gender roles of the Victorian era in England. Sorry, there we go. Okay, to begin, William Morris once proclaimed that he did not consider a man a socialist at all who was not prepared to admit the equality of women. So throughout his life and career, William Morris found success within and often in spite of the rigid socio-cultural landscape of Victorian England. He was a designer, a poet, novelist, publisher, socialist activist, translator, and so on. Morris is best known for founding the arts and crafts movement in England, an artistic revival that spread internationally and forever elevated the decorative arts in Western visual culture. The arts and crafts movement was predicated on Morris's rejection of both the Industrial Revolution and social inequality, including gender inequality. It was also inspired by his lifelong romantic idealization of medieval culture and traditional craftsmanship. As an Oxford-educated, upper-middle-class white man, it might seem unlikely that Morris would stand against, and much less actually act against, the mainstream Victorian society that served him so well. Yet, not only did Morris remain so committed to his subversive philosophies, he overcame tremendous societal pressure in order to pursue them professionally. Throughout his various artistic, literary, and political pursuits, William Morris also harbored a consuming passion for Iceland. Despite being somewhat of a homebody, Morris actually traveled to Iceland twice in 1871 and 1873, and he documented his experiences in a series of poems and journals. While these excursions are considered vital to Morris's later development as a writer and as a political activist, it is also important to note that Morris traveled to Iceland at an essential moment in his career as an artist. After founding his first interior decorating firm, Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company, and working there for a decade, Morris made his first journey to Iceland. There, he was absolutely delighted to discover not just the otherworldly, sublimely beautiful landscape, he also discovered that he could actually immerse himself into the real-life embodiment of his retrospective idealizations. In fact, 19th century Iceland seemed to bring to life Morris's vision of a utopian society, one untainted by factories and uninhibited by prescriptive ideologies about gender and social class. A community where elements of medieval culture and traditional homespun craftsmanship flourished in the modern world. In Morris's lifetime, England was characterized by the Industrial Revolution and even more notably by the staunch societal separation of men and women's spheres. Iceland, on the other hand, remained very rooted in the traditions and values of its medieval golden age, which, from the perspective of an outsider, seemed to embody Morris's ultimate utopia. These traditions in Iceland had been neither industrialized or gendered by the late 19th century. I think it's as fascinating as it is vital the profound influence of Iceland, and specifically its egalitarian gender culture, on the evolution of Morris's work as a textile designer. After visiting Iceland in 1871 and 73, and then founding his independent firm, Morris and Company, in 1875, William Morris focused his career for the next decade on traditional textile production. He began producing designs that have even more of an antiquated, maximalist, and so-called feminine aesthetic than how he started. Had he never seen his vision in some ways actually brought to life in Iceland, perhaps Morris might not have so boldly subverted the normative values and gender roles of Victorian-era society. Before visiting Iceland, Morris was already at the beginning stages of developing his anti-industrial philosophies, and he was laying the groundwork for his more iconic and mature designs. In his various writings and lectures, Morris lamented the waning significance of craftsmanship in the wake of modernity. Indeed, in England, the Industrial Revolution had entirely mechanized mainstream textile production, making handicrafts obsolete in favor of cheaper factory-produced goods. In turn, trends in decorative aesthetics were shifting to favor simplistic designs over the highly detailed, medieval-inspired motifs that Morris is now famous for. During his tenure with his first firm, Morris Marshall Faulkner and Company, during the 1860s, Morris had, of course, already forayed into anti-industrial methods and styles of design. While Morris's characteristic interest in organic, medieval-inspired forms was always evident in his work, before visiting Iceland, Morris was inventing patterns that do indicate some measure of conformity, although likely very reluctant, to the abstracted aesthetic increasingly popularized through factory production in England. Here, you can see Morris's very first wallpaper design, Trellis, from the early 1860s. It is a characteristic Morris pattern of lively organic forms, but it is simpler and more formalized and pictorial than some of his later works. At the time that Morris designed Trellis, a modern reform movement was sweeping across Victorian England, popularized by factory-made textiles and designer Owen Jones's aesthetic sourcebook, The Grammar of Ornament. This movement promoted artificial materials, mass production, and increasingly abstracted and even so-called masculine designs like the examples pictured here. Despite his passion for and expertise in medieval textiles, Morris's earliest designs, like Trellis, perhaps reveal that he had not yet entirely separated himself from the expectations of society at large. But after he returned from his second voyage to Iceland, Morris's later work with Morris and Company demonstrates an even clearer departure from mainstream visual culture, from the aesthetic of his designs to the production methods that he chose. Before he made his first visit there in 1871, William Morris had already deeply entertained his fascination with Iceland, and he wasn't the only one. Since the start of the 19th century, several survey groups from mainland Europe had explored Iceland and published writings on its geology, history, and culture. Due to Iceland's geographic isolation, Icelanders still held very fast to the traditions upon which their nation was first founded in the 10th century. They had yet to be meaningfully affected by mainland Europe's rapid modernization. By the late 19th century, when Morris visited, there were virtually no roads or railways in Iceland, and travel was conducted entirely on horseback. Educated Victorians, like Morris, were also very familiar with the stories of the medieval sagas of Icelanders, representing a widespread interest in exoticism, which could provide an escape from the daily grind of urban industrial revolution society. With the help of an Icelandic native that he met in England, Morris also even learned to speak and write the Icelandic language, and he worked on his own English translation of the sagas. To Morris, Iceland represented so much more than an escape. It would ultimately come to represent everything he sought to embody in his everyday life and career, even so far as for him to disregard the advantages that the Industrial Revolution might have afforded him personally and professionally, and to reject the Victorian hierarchy of gender that would have dissuaded his interest in handicrafts. Very most importantly to Morris is that medieval traditions of craftsmanship were still thriving in Iceland in the late 19th century. Being already well versed in the history of textile design across Europe, Morris sought out local traditional textiles while in Iceland. He, of course, encountered many such textiles that were being created and utilized contemporarily with no industrial influence. In fact, upon his return to England, Morris had a hand in the Victoria and Albert Museum's acquisition of several Icelandic textiles, including the 17th century embroidery pictured here on the left. This everyday exposure to the medieval aesthetics of traditional textiles in Iceland was possibly a catalyst for Morris to even more enthusiastically pursue his imagined medieval-inspired utopia, and thus to more fully disregard the new trends and technologies that were popular in Victorian England. Examining the relationship between craftsmanship and gender in Victorian England and Iceland, respectively, provides a convincing explanation for Morris's artistic development in the decade following his travels. But first, a formal comparison of Morris and Company textile designs and traditional Icelandic textile designs is also necessary to fully appreciate the profound influence of Iceland on William Morris. The Icelandic blómstursámur tradition is a freestyle embroidery technique that was used widely on interior decorating textiles and clothing before and throughout the 19th century. This aesthetic, bearing incredible similarity to the medieval designs he so admired, is what Morris would have seen being made and utilized in contemporary Iceland, rather than hanging in museums as emblems of a bygone era. These floral motifs appeared on clothing in homes and in civic buildings and were not necessarily associated with femininity. Here is an 1840 example of a blómstursámur cushion cover designed by an unknown artist. There are absolutely clear parallels between this aesthetic and Morris's post-Iceland designs. And here is Lotus, an interior decorating textile that Morris created shortly after his second trip to Iceland. Not only does Lotus strongly resemble the Icelandic example visually, but both textiles were also made using nearly identical materials and processes. The Icelandic cushion cover on the left primarily employs a split stitch technique involving alternating large and small stitches, and it is crafted with polychrome woolen yarn and silk on woolen fabric. Such wool was typically produced from sheep that the embroiderers had raised themselves, and dyes were homemade using local organic materials. Morris would have no doubt appreciated how Icelandic craftspeople were so intimately connected with each material they used and each stage of the design process. Like the Icelandic example, Morris's Lotus also uses a split stitch process and silken material. The only main difference is Lotus's inclusion of canvas rather than woolen fabric. After visiting Iceland, Morris fully committed to using organic materials and traditional embroidery and other methods when he could, and he even built an old-fashioned weaving loom in his home at Kelmscott Manor in order to do so. This is a photograph of a traditional Icelandic weaving loom that was being used contemporarily in Iceland when Morris visited, the likes of which had not been regularly used in mainland Europe during Morris's lifetime. The fact that medieval aesthetics and techniques were still widely utilized and highly esteemed in Icelandic visual culture proved to Morris that the traditions he admired could still exist in the modern world. But the influence of Icelandic textiles on Morris does go even deeper than aesthetics and means of production. Notably, Icelandic society, including its textile tradition, was not gendered and therefore facilitated the equal participation and collaboration of both men and women in different social classes. This marked a huge contrast against Victorian England, where the ideology of separate spheres dominated every facet of life, including textile production. The Industrial Revolution, besides transforming interior decorating trends, aggressively reinforced the staunch separation of male and female spheres in Victorian society. This social structure dictated and divided the roles, attributes, and activities that were deemed suitable for men and for women. The male sphere was associated with public, vocational, social, and political life. The female sphere was associated with private, domestic, and family life and was considered inferior. This ideology of separate spheres in England was perpetuated through popular literature, institutional practices, and normalized social customs and expectations. In the textile industry, factories dominated the design and production of textiles. These factories employed mostly low-class women to do the labor on assembly lines, whereas supervisory positions in the factories were given exclusively to men, and the designs were also generally determined by men. Handcrafted floral embroidery, such as Morris's Lotus and other Morris and Company designs of the same era, would have, in the eyes of many, been considered antithetical to the Industrial Revolution and conventional masculine activities and attributes. The domestic practice of craft was not associated with creativity or industry, but was rather considered a woman's simple expression of her assigned commitment to home and family. Privileged men would have been hesitant to embrace these associations for themselves, yet William Morris proudly took on the role of craftsperson and performed this role in his own home with Morris and Company. Perhaps Morris's exposure to contemporary Icelandic culture, in which the practice of domestic handicrafts had never been gendered or industrialized, ultimately helped empower him to disregard the cultural norms of the Victorian era. After all, he had discovered that the social and aesthetic values that were abandoned by his own society remained integral in the lives and the textiles of Icelanders. Prior to visiting Iceland, William Morris had already busied himself dreaming up a utopia that Morris biographer Peter Faulkner described as a society of equals in which every man and woman finds proper fulfillment. As a person who would later promote a socialist political agenda, Morris would certainly have identified with the social codes in Iceland even more so than those in England, particularly as they related to the philosophies of the arts and crafts movement. In the late 19th century, much of the social stratification in Iceland had nothing to do with gender. Several studies of medieval Iceland note that egalitarian relationships between men and women were fundamental to Icelandic society and national identity. Rather than gender, age and other acquired attributes determined social hierarchy, and this structure remained intact for decades, or centuries rather. By the late 19th century, when Morris visited, Icelandic women were actively founding and participating in women's organizations. They had the right to inherit money and property, and they were generally as literate and as educated as their male counterparts. Icelandic women were also traditionally given surnames through their matriarchal lineage. The textile arts of embroidery and weaving were held with high regard and practiced by members of all social classes, unlike in Victorian England, where it ranked pretty low in both the hierarchies of art and gender roles. In Iceland, textiles were typically utilized and cared for by families for generations, and makers were intimately involved in all stages of the design process, from raising sheep for wool to embroidering the finishing decorative touches. technological advancement was incredibly scarce due to Iceland's isolation and their devotion to medieval traditions upon which their nation was founded. Representatives from the Danish crown had actually attempted and failed to mechanize the Icelandic textile industry during the 18th century. But because Icelanders were such fierce defenders of their traditions and their way of life, this Danish initiative was abandoned, and the practice of textile making remained firmly rooted in its medieval origins. By the late 19th century, when Morris visited, traditional textiles were still being made in homes or in small domestic workshops by equal numbers of men and women. After observing this phenomenon in Iceland, Morris returned to England and made the executive decision to dissolve Morris Marshall Faulkner and Company. In 1875, Morris officially founded Morris and Company and turned his attention towards textiles, often working with the traditional loom he built in his home. The timeline of these events is likely no coincidence. Also telling is that Morris enlisted the help of male and female employees in the commercial production of his designs under the banner of Morris and Company. For example, Morris hired a female embroiderer and her daughters to collaborate with him in the creation of the aforementioned textile Lotus. He also frequently collaborated with his wife, Jane Burden Morris, and his daughters, Jenny and May, in every stage of the design process, increasingly embracing so-called feminine aesthetics like delicate floral motifs. His daughter May Morris went on to hold important leadership roles within her father's firm from a young age, and she became a prolific artist in her own right. And later in her life, she actually made her own voyage to Iceland, of course, recognizing the profound influence the country had on her father's life and career. This shift in both the production strategy and aesthetics of Morris's work after 1875 suggests that his Icelandic travels may have helped convince him to disregard Victorian gender roles without rejecting the actual processes and characteristics assigned to the female sphere. The timing of this shift indicates that it was after visiting Iceland that Morris began to even more fully practice what he was preaching. The idea that medieval practices and egalitarian social codes could be successfully applied to the modern world. It makes sense then that Morris would fully embrace the role of a domestic textile maker who delights in beautiful floral designs, acting upon a vision that was very incongruent with the structure of his own society, yet which he saw firsthand unfolding in Iceland. Ultimately, William Morris achieved commercial success through his work with Morris and Company and through the international spread of the arts and crafts movement. And along the way, his convictions about gender equality and revolutionary socialist activism only grew stronger. Morris's 1890 novel, News from Nowhere, a futuristic fictional narrative, is an obvious continuation of the egalitarian ethos with which he designed textiles. Its 9th chapter focuses on two male characters who are discussing the role of women in their social circles. One man says to the other, "The men no longer have any opportunity of tyrannizing over the women or the women over the men. Both of those took place in old times." This literary exercise no doubt stems from what Morris had gained creatively and personally during and after his travels to Iceland. His experience of the Icelandic emphasis on gender equality and the elevation of traditional craftsmanship likely helped catalyze his subversion of the oppressive societal framework of Victorian England, first through textile design and then more overtly through socialist political activism and literature. In conclusion, I believe that a closer analysis of Morris's relationship to Iceland is truly essential to better understanding his development as an artist. Morris's utopian daydreams alone might not have been quite enough to encourage his wholehearted pursuit of a perceived antiquated and anti-masculine career in traditional textile design with Morris and Company. Iceland appealed directly to William Morris's boundless imagination. Besides informing his literary pursuits and his political affiliations, Iceland surely played a role in his artistic development because it brought to life his romanticized notion that the role of craftspeople and their traditions, regardless of gender or social class, could indeed be celebrated and elevated, even within an increasingly patriarchal and industrialized modern society. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. That was wonderful. I've been enjoying these photographs that you have up here. I'm assuming that these are those that you took on your own trip to Iceland. Is that
Yes,
correct?
they are. I did a research trip on this topic actually about 7 years ago as part of my undergraduate thesis. And these are some of the images I took following in the footsteps of William Morris in Iceland.
That's wonderful. In fact, I would love to open this up for questions, and I see them coming in the chat thread, but just kind of continuing that with your own physical experience in being in Iceland. I'm curious how you felt like that helped you to understand William Morris's process better. You were mentioning I'm not going to say it right, the Bloomstersalmer embroideries.
Yes.
Did you encounter those on your trip? Is that what kind of brought you along these lines, or what was it about your trip and being physically there that really impacted you?
Yeah, I encountered many examples of that at this point in time in museums in Reykjavik in Iceland, as now they're very much more part of a bygone era. Now Iceland is very industrialized, of course, but I mean, seeing them in person and imagining William Morris, who was so idealistic and excited, like seeing a lot of these things, not in museums, but out and about in people's homes, in civic buildings and churches being actually used and loved, would have made him really excited, made him think, maybe I could have a hand in bringing this experience back to England. And my trip to Iceland and the project I did there kind of deviated a bit from this exact research, because I focused a little bit more on what he was experiencing, like in the landscape. He traveled around on horseback and he really roughed it out there, which was, I think, unusual for him. He wasn't, as far as I know, like super known for adventurous travel or for camping out, but he did it in Iceland and was really just blown away by kind of the feeling of being on a different planet and being in a different culture, kind of going back to the times of the Icelandic sagas. And I believe that just not only was that inspiring artistically to be somewhere so beautiful, but inspiring to him as a socialist, as somebody who really wanted to eradicate gender inequality and social inequality. Of, we could go back to this without going back. We could just implement some of these ideas moving forward.
Mm-hmm. A transformative trip on so many levels, then it's clear to see. So that's wonderful. I'm noticing these other questions coming in too.
Yes.
In the chat. So Susan is asking, how did Iceland's gender roles compare with what was happening or was historically the case in Scandinavia, if you've looked into that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know a bit, which is like Iceland was long kind of under technically the rule of the Danish crown, but Denmark's attempts to actually go over there and influence them were met with quite a bit of resistance. I have not researched as much about what was going on in Denmark and other parts of Scandinavia, but I do know that as much of Western Europe was industrializing and moving more towards social inequality on gender and social class levels, Iceland stayed very insulated from that. One, just because it was so difficult for someone to even get there, and two, when people did get there, Icelanders were quite resistant to their influence.
That makes sense, just even geographically with the country itself. That's wonderful. Yoli has a question coming right after saying, excellent presentation. I like the Morris quote about equality between gender. Any insight on Morris's attitude toward the Victorian Empire? I think trying to think about things from an imperial perspective or colonialism.
Right. Also a great question. From my understanding of just his experience in Iceland, much of what I'm talking about is not so much Iceland was objectively and literally this paradise. It was, he saw it as an example of like his utopian ideas. And I think while he was there and on other just kind of life experiences, he was struck by people in poverty. He was very moved by the plights of people, like, of course, at the hand of British Empire and colonialism. I think he would have been very much against that. As as a white man in Victorian England, his like nuance there might not have been like the most informed. I don't really know, but I would like to think he would have been critical of it. I don't know so much about it though.
That's wonderful. I'm thinking too, and this is kind of deviating from your topic, but if people are interested in that, he has also made some comments along the lines of connecting this imperialistic mindset to industrialization and the market, and wanting and critiquing that in some of his writings too. So that's something that I think is kind of moving in another direction, but I know he has commented on that, thinking about it specifically in relation to the market. A couple of other questions coming. Oh, and so we've got Florence has a question here. You mentioned that William Morris's practice at Morris and Company were gender egalitarian. Do you know if the policies in the were held too in this prior Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company?
Also a great question. I don't know as much about the everyday practice of this firm. It was the names of three men who got together and were working on things kind of a little bit more in the circle of other industrialized textile designers at the time. I know that specifically with just Morris and Company, named only for William Morris, you see a lot more credits of women's name on the work, such as that of his wife, his daughters, and other women craftspeople he would bring in and work with, often like in his own home in a communal space.
And I think that does can suggest a shift that way too, if you're noticing that.
I think so.
So I can see that. A few more other comments too. Did Morris use images or storylines in any of his textile designs?
He definitely did. He was very inspired, like a lot of the pre-Raphaelite artists and other people kind of working at the fringes of art at the time in medieval stories. So the Icelandic sagas, as I mentioned, were very inspiring to Morris, but also like the King Arthur fables, a lot of poetry by Tennyson. These were a lot of narratives that William Morris would explore in textile design. So he does. I didn't discuss any narrative examples in this presentation, but he absolutely does.
That's and I'm now just thinking about Icelandic embroidery. It seems like there aren't any types of narratives or storylines, and I'm just going off of the examples you showed. They're more just floral motifs that are included.
Yeah, a lot of decorative art. I think there are some like explorations of the Icelandic sagas and the history of Iceland and their art, but mostly, from what I could tell, and I think the examples that William Morris would have encountered in everyday spaces, like people's homes, on their clothing, were these decorative floral motifs.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Wonderful. Thank you. I don't know if there are any other questions or comments coming in. This has been so enlightening. I don't know anything about embroideries that are produced in Iceland, so I loved seeing those comparisons, and I can really see your argument in how those enriched William Morris's own style and his perspective. So I really loved this. Thank you so much, Emily, for sharing your scholarship and your knowledge with us today.
And thank you for having me, and thank you for all of the thoughtful questions and comments. I really appreciate everyone's engagement.
It's great. Before I end this particular meeting, I wanted to also let our members know that we do have some other events coming up to promote. And let me I'm just gonna pin myself here so I show up in the recording explaining these. So we have a couple of events. I'm going to just put them in the chat thread right now in case you are interested in joining us. I know we have several members that are attending today. We also have some people from the general public who have joined us too. If you're interested in joining our society, we welcome you to consider doing that. And you can contact us. I actually have our Gmail account just listed at the very bottom of this in the chat thread. It's William Morris Society US at gmail.com. But I want to just mention these upcoming events. Our former president of the society, Michael Robertson, recently moved to the UK, and he is giving an informal talk that's hosted by the William Morris Society in the UK coming up. It's titled William Morris's Utopian Designs. It's on Tuesday, May 17th. And I know we have some people that are listening in from Europe. This may be a time that works out well for you. So it's a 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern time here in the United States, but it's 6 o'clock p.m. in the UK. So that might appeal to you. There is a booking fee of £5, and the link is included there in the chat thread. If you're a member, you may have already received this in an email with this particular link. We also have Bill Tyers speaking to us. He will be speaking to us in June, and we're looking forward to this. Bill Tyer is the director of the Glessner House in Chicago, and so he'll be speaking about the arts and crafts, particularly relating to the Glessner House. We're excited about this virtual presentation. We were hoping to have an in-person event earlier this year, and it was canceled due to the pandemic and the Omicron numbers rising. But we have this virtual event scheduled for Wednesday, June 8th. That'll be at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. And so if you're a member, you'll receive more registration details soon about that. If you are joining us just from the public and you'd like to attend, you can email us again at our Gmail account, William Morris Society US at gmail.com, and we can get you that information too. I thought I saw a hand popping up from someone, and I'm not sure, it's not showing anymore. Was there a question or a comment? Maybe that was by error. So thank you to everyone who's joining. I'm seeing some wonderful comments here. Someone saying William Morris is looking down on us and he is smiling, which I like to think so too. So thank you everyone for joining us. Please enjoy the rest of your weekend. For me on the West Coast, this was a great start to my weekend joining. So I hope you have a great day. Thank you.